So, welcome everybody to our session here. I hope we can make this interactive so that the chat is there. You can put questions in and comments. My name's Simon Garrett. I am Head of Public Engagement for Bristol Zoological Society. Also sit on the Communicate steering group as well. So we're going to have a session this afternoon from Debbie Stockwell. We're going to get an update from Defra. Everything to do with Defra, not everything. Just things that Debbie is in charge of. And this is where we're going to run it. So I'll just give a little brief introduction to Debbie. And then Debbie's going to do us a little presentation for about half the session. And then we'll open up to questions and comments. And if we run out of those, then you can come on stage and show us any natural bits that you've got behind your desk, cones, fossils, anything you like. I've got a duck skull back there as well if you want to see it later on. I also picked up on the Avalon Marshes. Okay, so Debbie is joint head of the Environment Improvement Team in Defra, responsible for all sorts of things, delivering the Environment Targets Programme, refresh of the 25-year Environment Plan, target clauses in the Environment Bill, etc., etc. Also, one thing that interested me was she spent a year working on climate strategy for the state of Victoria in Australia. I've been very impressed over the last 10 years or so in lots of amazing behaviour change stuff that zoos in Victoria have been doing as well. And I still to visit Australia, but I think Australia seems to me to be way ahead on many of these things of actually getting people involved and making some really good environmental decisions. So I don't know whether you're going to talk about that at all, either Debbie, or whether you want to refer back to it, but that interested me greatly. So I will stop. And Debbie, if you can take over and share your slides, I'll monitor the chat as we go along, and then we'll take questions and comments after you've done your presentation.
Thank you, Simon, and afternoon to everyone. So Simon said, my name is Debbie Stockwell. I head up the Environmental Improvement Team in Defra, and basically myself and my job share partner, Lucy Stone, are responsible for delivering 25-year Environment Plan and relevant parts of the Environment Bill, which is quite a big agenda. And so I think what I would say is bear with me is that we have obviously a huge number of policy teams in Defra that are responsible for detailed delivery of all the different elements of the 25-year Environment Plan. So I'll do my best to answer any questions when I finish my presentation, but there might be some things, particularly if they're quite detailed, that I might need to come back on, because I can't claim to be an expert on absolutely everything that Defra is doing on the environment, because it is just so big now. But that's a good thing, because it means actually we have so many people working on it, trying to work to deliver the objective of the 25-year Environment Plan, which is ultimately to improve the environment. So I'm going to try and share my presentation now, so bear with me. This is the first time I've done an online presentation since COVID started, believe it or not, so this is all new to me, but I will give it a good go. So 2 seconds. Right, you see yourselves for a second. There you go. You should now see the presentation. I can't see anyone or any of your comments while I'm doing this. So Simon has very nicely said that he will group together any comments that you make during the presentation, and we'll pick those up afterwards. Simon, can you see my presentation?
I can. And the other thing, if you could hide the on-screen sharing notes, that's beautiful. Brilliant. Lovely.
Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to talk about the Environment Bill and key Defra environmental strategies. So first of all, this slide really captures the state of the natural environment in England at the moment, and the trends that we're seeing across different indicators where we monitor what's happening in the environment. As you can see from this, many of our environmental metrics show that actually we're seeing flat or worsening performance across the different metrics, and this really demonstrates the need for urgent action. And just to kind of like talk through these in a little bit more detail, for example, for air quality, which is in the first top left, we're seeing the increase in ammonia emissions. We're seeing the abundance of priority species showing a decline from 1970 to 2015. Graph 3 shows that air quality PM 2.5 is flat, and I can continue. I think you all know that the state of the environment that we are experiencing in England at the moment. So what is the political and economic context? So there is growing public demand for environmental action. The proportion of the public that are now worried about environment and climate change has reached a record 25% in February 2020, and that's the highest level since this started to be recorded in July 1990. And obviously, one of the things that we've been doing in Defra is setting our future environmental protections now that we've left the EU, and looking at what mechanisms we want to put in place, given that so much of our environmental policy was previously driven from Europe. And the government has a manifesto commitment to deliver the most ambitious environmental programme of any country on earth. So just a small job to do. So in terms of Defra's vision for the environment, there's basically two overarching objectives: the urgent need to reverse biodiversity loss, and our legally binding objective to bring all greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. And the 25-year environment plan, published in 2018, set the overarching narrative for much of Defra's work in this space, and then set out how we would improve the environment over a generation. And it looked at creating richer habitats for wildlife, improving air and water quality, and curbing plastics in the world's oceans. And the plan is underpinned by 10 goals and a set of metrics. So this slide captures what those 10 goals are, and also the policies that we will put in place to deliver them. So we've said we will achieve clean air, clean and plentiful water, thriving plants and wildlife. We'd reduce the risk of harm for environmental hazards. We'd use resources from nature more sustainably and efficiently, and enhance beauty, heritage, and engagement with the natural environment. But we also recognise we need to manage pressures on the environment by mitigating and adapting to climate change, minimising waste, managing exposure to chemicals, and enhancing biosecurity. So a huge amount of work is captured by the 25-year environment plan. And since we launched that in January 2018, there's been a number of positive steps that we've taken to protect and enhancing the natural environment. But it's definitely not the end of the story, but it's kind of a journey that we're on at the moment. So I won't read all of these out, but to give you a sense, we've had the agricultural white paper, which placed environment at the heart of agriculture. We're seeing a huge shift at the moment in terms of moving away from the common agricultural policy towards environmental land management and future farming. We had the draft environment bill, which put the 25-year environment plan on a statutory footing. Government's announced biodiversity net gain for development. We've got the Nature for Climate Fund. We've had a ban on plastic straws, stirrers and cotton buds, and so on and so forth. Now, a key vehicle for delivering the ambition of the 25-year environment plan is the Environment Bill. And obviously, Environment Bill was introduced into Parliament in October 2019. We all hoped that we might have achieved royal assent perhaps in the last year, but it was paused in Parliament and has now just been reintroduced. The Environment Bill supports our efforts to set a world-leading domestic agenda to address environment and climate, the environment and climate emergency. And we have put in a number of measures through the bill which will help to improve air quality, improve ecosystems, and drive resource efficiency. So as we speak, the bill is in the second reading in the House of Lords today, and the committee stage will start on the 21st of June. So in terms of what the Environment Bill is, now I realise there's probably different levels of knowledge about the bill around here, but to capture kind of what it is and where it is at the moment. So there's kind of 5 key areas within the bill. First of all, establishing green governance. So that's putting environmental principles for policy making in law. It's about establishing the Office for Environmental Protection, which will be kind of providing scrutiny and enforcement over environmental policy in environmental law, in England. And also will establish a new statutory cycle of target setting, monitoring, planning and reporting. And this is where the new legally binding environmental targets will come in. In air quality, the bill health benefits by improving air quality. And as part of that, we'll have a legally binding target for fine particulate matter. It will drive improvements to into nature by introducing mandatory biodiversity net gain and a number of other measures. and will also deliver resource efficiency into a more circular economic model. And there's additional water measures in the bill which will help secure long-term resilient water and wastewater services. Now, as the bill goes through Parliament, a number of changes happen, either because there's amendments that come through the parliamentary process or that because government makes changes to the bill. And there's a number of elements of the bill that have evolved since the bill was first introduced to Parliament. So there's now a due diligence obligation to set mandatory requirements on larger businesses that use agricultural commodities. There are action thresholds for the Office for Environmental Protection, and the Office for Environmental Protection will also have a remit of covering climate change legislation as well as environmental legislation. There's also been amendments with regard to storm overflows to improve water quality. And also, most recently, the government tabled an amendment to create a duty for a new historic for species abundance by 2030 in England, which is aiming to halt the decline of nature. So this will work in tandem with the 25-year environment plan commitment and the longer term targets we also have in place in the bill to try and reverse the decline that we're seeing across the environment. So a little bit more on local nature recovery strategies, which are part of the bill. So the bill introduces provisions which require the development of local nature recovery strategies. And they're a new system of spatial strategies for nature covering the whole of England. And each strategy will map the most valuable existing habitats for nature, map specific proposals for creating or improving habitats for nature, and agree priorities for nature recovery. Then most recently, we've had two documents that we've published under the guise of the 25-year environment plan. The first was the England Peat Action Plan, which set out the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme. So that's money to restore 35,000 hectares of degraded peatland. We have also committed to consulting on banning the sale of peat and peat-containing products in the amateur sector by 2025. That's not the easiest statement to say. And also we've invested £2.7 million in the Great North Bog, which is a large-scale peatland restoration initiative in the north of England, which is important both for climate as well as objectives. Alongside that, we published the England Trees Action Plan, and this sets out measures to better protect our existing trees and woodland and set us on the path to ensure that we've got at least 12% woodland cover by the middle of the century, supported by over 80 announcements bringing together a comprehensive plan of action. So this will be delivered under the Nature for Climate Fund as well. And over 500 million of the total 640 million for Nature for Climate is dedicated to trees. The government is aiming to treble woodland creation rates by the end of this Parliament, and that reflects the UK's overall target, which is in the manifesto, of planting 30,000 hectares of trees per year by the end of this Parliament. So I think there's a question of kind of like what next? It's a busy year, not just because of UK having international leadership, but also we've just got so much happening domestically as well. So we've got the G7 Leaders Summit coming up. We will be publishing our outcome indicator framework shortly, and that will provide further information on trends against the environmental indicators. And then we will publish our 25-year environment plan annual review, which we do every year, in around about July, and this will reflect on the progress that we're making under the goals of the 25-year environment plan. We'll be consulting on a local air quality management quality management in the summer, and then we will also start the environmental land management national pilots in the autumn. BEIS's net zero strategy should also come out in the autumn, but that's a government-wide document, and all the departments are leading on different elements of that. Set out how they would deliver future carbon budgets. We've got the the Convention on Biological Diversity in October, and we will have COP26 in November, where Defra is organising a nature-themed day as part of the event. And then moving into next year, we will be having a consultation on the environmental targets in early 2022, with the aim of having those targets in place by the deadline in the Environment Bill, which is October 2022. And then we will have a refreshed 25-year environment plan as required by the bill for January 2023, as well as the significant improvement test that the bill requires to demonstrate whether the targets we have are enough to drive environmental improvement in England. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Debbie. Okay, well, we can open up for questions. Maria's asked, will the slides be available, please? Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think all of these sessions are being recorded as well, so you'll also be able to listen back to these sessions, any of the sessions, or almost all of the sessions from Communicate. As, in fact, I'll put a plug in here while I'm thinking about it. Previous Communicate conferences have pretty much all been recorded as well, so there's a fantastic archive of Communicate presentations going back over the years if you look at the Communicate website. So yes. Okay, we'll open up to questions. You can either put these in the chat, or you can hit the big blue button and ask to share your audio and video and actually come up on stage. Make a point or ask a question as well. While we're waiting for that to happen, I have a question, partly just because I like this anyway, and partly it was influenced by the last session I was in about from the Behavioural Insights team. Is there a plan for not only targets for achieving certain things, but actually a plan for big celebrations and parties? Because I think what the environmental sector is often very bad at doing is celebrating success. The narrative is so often negative, things like all the first graphs you showed, how things are going down the pan. And I think there are probably already great improvements, and as we begin to make more improvements, I'd like to see every 3 years or every 5 years a massive national party with a great celebration of all that we've achieved. So have we got plans for that as well?
So it's not, I have to say, it's not explicitly part of 25-year environment plan, but we have said in the 25-year environment plan that we will look at behaviour, and we are going to be doing some work on that in the coming months. And I think that that you're right, that it's thinking about how you celebrate successes as well as kind of try and change behaviour and influence people and organisations ultimately to contribute to environmental improvement. So I think that it's certainly something we can have a think about. And I would also say my feeling is that Nature Day at COP26 is an opportunity to really showcase what the UK and England are doing. And I think that we're working very hard to think about what is it that we want to show the rest of the world about what we're doing here. So I think there's some opportunities around that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine, for pointing out there are also questions in the Q&A tab, so I'll nip over to that as well. So Chris has asked, can you comment on how activities are being coordinated with devolved nations?
Okay, so we have very active coordination with devolved administrations. It's slightly different in different areas, but we have a team that manages that relationship both on the Environment Bill, and then individual policy teams also coordinate their activities. So there are some things that we work together on. And we do joint efforts, and there's some things where we do things separately. So the devolved administrations have their own equivalent to the 25-year environment plan, and they are also looking at having similar kind of mechanisms like Office for Environmental Protection, for example. So we do talk to them regularly, we exchange ideas, we look at opportunities to work together, but it is very much kind of done on a case-by-case basis depending on the issue. Obviously, there are some reserve policy issues. I think that's more relevant to climate than environment. So there are things around energy policy where decisions are taken UK-wide, but a lot of the time in the environment, the devolved administrations will make their own decisions about the measures they want to take and put in place. But we try and align those as far as we're able to.
Okay, thank you. And then actually taking that one stage further, so I mean that's coordinating across the devolved nations. What about then globally? What discussions go on? I mean, obviously we've got the COP15 and then COP26 coming up. I guess that's probably the answer to this question, but how much coordination is there internationally?
I mean, there's a huge amount of coordination internationally. Obviously, by being hosts of COP26, we're organising a lot of meetings. We were responsible for the climate and energy ministers, for example, ahead of G7. There's been a number of announcements and commitments made on biodiversity that the UK as kind of hosts of that have been the ones that have been in the driving seat. There's also there's international architecture around most things within the environment. So you've got things in marine, for example, where there's heavy involvement in the international UN fora and other groups that exist. You've got the same on the biodiversity side. And certainly, our own biodiversity approach is driven ultimately by the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. So there's very much a read across to what we actually implement domestically and also what we then feed back. So we're very much looking at what we're doing domestically at the moment and saying, should we be asking this of other countries? Should we be looking to do more? How does that kind of interaction take place? And, I think there is a big focus on climate this year because of COP, but clearly the role of nature in delivering climate outcomes and ultimately the role of it, biodiversity loss as well, are all playing into that conversation. I would say that, even from a point of view of kind of more informal relationships, as an example, my team is responsible for greening government commitments, and there are informal international groups of best practice about what governments are doing to kind of tackle their own environmental performance and so forth. So there's lots of different ways that we interact internationally. COVID has obviously made it perhaps a bit more virtual than it has been previously, but there's certainly lots that we can share and lots we can learn from others as well.
Thank you. And actually, you mentioned COP26, which lots of people have been talking. The world is talking about COP26. It strikes me, and it just may be me, that COP15, the Convention on Biological Diversity, has almost been overshadowed. And of course, it wasn't until recently that actually the date was even set. Is there any kind of thought or plan to kind of big up COP15 a bit more so that it's on a level with them? It's now, they're both in the autumn, COP15 and COP26, and actually marry them together.
I certainly think there's thinking about how we use the momentum for both events to obviously raise the profile of environmental and climate issues that the UK cares about. And I think, there's obviously something different when you're hosting something. This is the biggest, I think, conference that the UK has ever hosted. That in itself obviously kind of raises the profile before you even get into what the subject matter is. But I think that, it certainly kind of in my mindset and in the mind of others in the department, we do see them as kind of like a twin events, where ultimately, we're looking at how we use both of those events to drive objectives and to, we're obviously thinking very hard about kind of how we deliver through CBD as well as COP.
Great. Okay, let me come back into the chat. So I'll pick up quick questions from the chat and the Q&A. So Michael Wilberforce has asked, when do you think the strategy of biodiversity net gain is likely to come into force, based on when the Environment Bill is likely to achieve royal assent, and also any implementation period that will follow it?
So I'm not a policy expert on biodiversity net gain. That's managed by a different team. So Environment Bill, we're obviously, hoping to achieve royal assent as soon as we're able to, hopefully before the end of the year. The implementation period will need to be kind of determined by the policy team responsible for that. But I'm happy to take that question away and kind of feed back a more specific answer. I'm afraid I'm not entirely in the know on that one.
Okay, thank you. And Sophie's asked, did I hear correctly that the proportion of the public concerned has reached a record of 25%? I didn't quite catch
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. And do you have any insights of how much that might have changed, particularly probably gone up during COVID?
So there has been quite a lot of work done during COVID about kind of public attitudes to environment, nature, and kind of access to nature. So we have got quite a rich source of information, kind of reflecting latest public views. I couldn't tell you specifically how much that's changed by over the course of COVID, but again, I could take that away and, the statisticians can probably give a more accurate answer on that. But I think that, we've been, as a department, working very hard to try and understand what the interaction is between kind of COVID, lockdowns, people's attitudes to the environment. There's no doubt that people have been accessing nature more. The evidence is clear. But actually, what it's also really demonstrated is for those people who can't access nature, lockdown has been really hard. And, there are some people who cannot readily get into green space. And that's something that as a department, we are taking very seriously as well. And access to nature, beauty and heritage and engagement is all part of 25-year environment plan and will be very much part of what we're thinking about as we go through to the refresh of the 25-year environment plan.
Thank you. I'm just going to nip back over to the Q&A. So Catherine asked, how will the Environment Bill and its targets and so on be shared and communicated? Obviously, there's communication within the sector, but this is thinking about the wider population.
So we will have a consultation on environmental targets next year. And alongside of that, I expect that there will be some broader comms in terms of like what it means more, you know, for the public more widely. So, and I think that we will really see probably, I think, you know, as we get to the point where we actually start sharing more concrete information about what the levels of targets will be and what they cover, that, you know, I can imagine there's going to be more media interested in what we're doing and kind of what the impact will be. So, you know, we do obviously regularly work with stakeholders and they're involved in the process already. And, you know, I think that will, you know, I think also once the Environment Bill has hopefully achieved royal assent, there'll be more capacity within kind of stakeholders as well to kind of like really get involved in the detail of the targets. And that's why it's quite nice that the consultation will follow kind of early next year. And then, as we've said, the targets will be set by October 2022. So at that point in time, you know, there'll obviously be, you know, quite a lot of communications work done around kind of what they are and what they mean in practice. And then when we have the refreshed 25-year environment plan, we'll have to set out actually kind of, you know, the delivery of those targets. So that will feed through to 2023. So I think there'll be quite a lot of work around that in the next year.
Okay, thank you. Just looking back into the chat, so Sarah Dale has commented, much of the proposed Environment Bill could cause a huge shift in a positive direction for biodiversity. However, proposed amendments to a weakening of the HABS regs, that habitat regulations, are really concerning. How are the two proposals compatible, as they appear to be contradictory within the same proposal? So
we've obviously, well, what I would say first of all is that, you know, overall the government is absolutely committed to ensuring that environmental protections are maintained and enhanced. And I think it's really, you know, from the government point of view, it's much more about kind of looking at how we come out of EU exit and the opportunities it gives us to improve our existing domestic and our legacy EU laws, and how we actually use that to support our high environmental ambitions. And I think ministers have really wanted to take the opportunity to consider that and what it actually means for environmental policy.
Thank you. Okay, I have another question in my mind, and please, anyone else can either put questions in the chat or the Q&A. I'll monitor both, or if you want to come up on stage as well. I was just looking at the figures, the amount of money being put to tree planting and things like that, and it sounds a lot. I mean, millions of pounds always sounds a lot of money, but then of course we've just spent billions on COVID. I just wonder, this is a kind of personal opinion thing. Do we think the amount of money being put towards this is proportionate yet to the scale of the issue?
So I think that one of the things that we will really be looking at as we're developing the environmental targets and also kind of heading through to the refreshed 25-year environment plan is kind of like looking at the scale of action we've got already and what that means for progress, and therefore, you know what more might need to be done. I mean, I think this is a massive injection of money, and what I would say is that not everything is about public spending. And I think one of the big things for us is really looking at the role of green finance, the role of market mechanisms and so forth, to look at other ways that you can drive, you know, money coming into this space and driving activities. So I think that we're really excited about the possibilities that can bring. But obviously, you know, there are some things, and perhaps more on the biodiversity side than on the tree side, that, you know, ultimately just, you know, do need public funding. And that's why obviously we're looking at the role of the agricultural support systems going forward, and their role in supporting environmental improvement as well. But certainly, I think, you know, we are always looking at all the levers we have available to us to drive environmental improvement, rather than just say it has to be purely spending.
Thank you. Sophie has asked, the consultation on environmental targets, what scope will that have? How much influence will the public responses have?
So at the moment, ministers will have to take decisions about exactly what they will have, what the consultation will cover, but we would expect that it would cover, you know, what the targets are, what, you know, how many targets there are going to be, and what level they would be or could be set at, as well as the evidence that we have that underpins them. We did do a policy paper on target setting last summer, which set out the framework. So certainly if anyone wants to kind of have a cold flannel on their head for the afternoon to kind of read what we set out before, there's kind of like the framework that's set out in there and the process that we're going through. So, you know, there's quite a bit of information about the approach we're taking. Responses, I mean, consultation responses are taken seriously. As an example, so I previously worked on the Environment Bill and the consultation on the draft bill for, you know, the setting up of the Office for Environmental Protection. It was one of the largest responses to any government consultation ever. It was tens of thousands of responses. And, you know, we went through them all, we analysed them, and we considered them in the approach that we took. And, you know, that is ultimately why government consults. So, you know, certainly we want to hear the views that people have. But we'd also encourage those who work for stakeholder engagement organisations to engage in the process as it's ongoing.
Thank you. We mentioned targets a lot and things like this. Of course, there have been lots of international targets. You know, the Millennium Development Goals were a classic. That, of course, then many of the targets weren't met. So when setting targets, the obvious next question is then, what happens if the targets aren't met?
Okay, so that is obviously still to be determined by the final Environment Bill. So the bill does set out the approach to target setting and the role of the Office for Environmental Protection in terms of actually kind of holding government to account in meeting its environmental legislation. And, you know, it will be the final determine what that process is. But certainly by having kind of legal weight behind it, you know, it does, you know, we've seen it in the climate space. You can see the difference that having legally binding targets means for actually, you know, the serious consideration of kind of delivery of carbon budgets and ultimately, you know, leading to the net zero target itself. So, you know, it is an effective lever, but obviously the important thing is also what we do policy wise to underpin that, to make sure that we're putting the measures in place that can drive the environmental improvement.
Lovely, thank you. Claire Holland has asked, are there any plans in place to ensure the 25-year environment plan stays relevant?
Yeah, so under the bill, we're required to refresh every 5 years. And as I mentioned, the next one is in January 2023. So we will have this kind of process, you know, all the way through up to kind of, you know, over the next couple of decades to, you know, make sure that we are looking at making sure we've got the right range of measures in place. But also we've got the annual report that comes out every year that will be scrutinised by Office for Environmental Protection. There will be parliamentary scrutiny as well. So there's lots of mechanisms around kind of the plan to make sure that, you know, we remain on track to deliver. And the bill itself effectively puts 25-year environment plan on a statutory footing. So it changes that relationship to mean that, you know, government effectively has to make sure that it stays relevant.
Lovely, thank you. I have another quick question as well, in case anyone else, to give time for other people. To what extent does government rely on, this is a kind of wider question, I suppose, when things like this are being planned, to what extent does government have in mind that a lot of the delivery will be done by NGOs, for example? Because obviously there's lots and lots and lots of organisations working in this space. How does that kind of relationship work in terms of delivery?
So we are very aware that we rely heavily on others to deliver for us, and that, you know, as a core government department, that, you know, we can't do all this ourselves. We need other people to work with us. And I think, you know, first principle, you know, we have our arm's length bodies that we work closely with, and we've got the other kind of bodies that we sponsor as well, like Canal and River Trust, those sorts of organisations that we provide funding, and we make sure there's steers in terms of actually how that money is spent environmentally. And then, you know, there's the whole NGO world out there as well that is responsible. So all the policy teams that underpin 25-year environment plan have direct relationships with their various delivery bodies. Centrally, we also have a delivery forum where we bring together kind of the key players to discuss the kind of their roles in delivering 25-year environment plan, to make sure that we're kind of keeping track of the progress that's being made. And then we also look at specific interventions. So last year, the Green Recovery Challenge Fund was a really key example of that. We recognised the impacts of COVID on the sector. We also recognised the need to drive jobs and skills in the environmental sector. And, you know, ultimately ministers decide to put in, you know, tens of millions of pounds into supporting the sector, ultimately driving delivery of 25-year environment plan objectives, as well as managing the recovery from COVID.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions? I'm having a look at the chat, Q&A. Or I have another one to throw in as well then. We've got, what, 40 people on this call. I don't know how many of them were previously, I should also run a poll actually, but I don't know how to set them up. They were previously very engaged with the environment plan and the bill. If people are feeling disconnected from it and feel they want to be more connected to it, what are the mechanisms for kind of getting involved in particularly being more connected with delivery?
So I think that certainly keeping an eye out for opportunities, whether it's things like the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, or, for example, we have funds around to help delivery partners take advantage of green finance, so that they can, there's a bit of pump priming money available, that if you've got a project where you feel that there's an opportunity for using green finance and you need some setup costs, there's schemes there for those sorts of things. There's lots of information on gov.uk in terms of the different schemes and funds that are available. Then I think that at the moment there is a lot of focus on Nature for Climate, and the money came through there. So certainly, if you're interested in either kind of trees or peat, the recent action plans really set out the work that's going to happen in that space, and the potential opportunities around how that money is going to be used. And then I would say that in terms of environmental, where there's going to be quite a lot of support coming for environmental measures coming forward. The government has put out a couple of publications already, and there will be more coming about how that will work in practice. And there's quite a lot of stakeholder engagement that happens on that. So certainly lots of opportunities for people to get involved and understand what that might mean in terms of delivery. So I think it depends on people's interest and where that lies. But certainly if people feel that they're not perhaps as plugged in as they would like to be and have any questions, do let us know, and we can kind of make the connections to the relevant teams and work if that's useful.
Brilliant, lovely. Okay, I'm looking at the clock. There's the next session, the sort of wind up session, Communicate, starts at 4 o'clock, and maybe some people want 5 minutes just to let their ears out of their headphones or whatever, if anyone's wearing those. But I'm just going to ask a last question, just kind of reflecting back on something else at the beginning. So you worked in Australia for a year. I'm just really interested in, do you have any insights or just personal thoughts about the difference in working in Australia and the UK?
More different. I think it shocked me how different it was at the time, coming from what was quite a forward-leaning UK government on climate policy, having got the back then it was the 2010 target that we had in place, and we'd also started both the UK and joined the EU emissions trading system. So I think one of the key reasons for going out there was not only to kind of share our thinking about kind of how you can reduce emissions, but also kind of how at the time the kind of the different states in Australia were looking at setting up a state-based emissions trading system. So I think it was sort of thinking about how you take what you're doing and influence others, but put it in their context. So thinking about the kind of federal and state structure in Australia, and thinking about different ways that you can actually build ideas and concepts, and for example, do things at quite a small scale, but also doing things like, actually one of the things we did was linked to the RGGI kind of emissions trading system in the US as a way, and we could join that as a state-based government, which you probably wouldn't be able to do as kind of like a borough council or a county council in the UK in quite the same way. So you got quite a lot of flexibilities by being state-led. I think one thing that I was also massively impressed by was the strength of the NGO community out there, and at the time I think that actually it was probably more visible and more active in some ways, and bringing up issues that perhaps weren't that kind of high profile in the UK. And I think particularly one of the things was protection of ancient woodlands, and also kind of push back against invasive native species, which I think has kind of built more prominence in the UK in the last few years. But I just felt at the time it was just so much more part of the conversation out there, perhaps than it had been out here. So I think I got a huge amount from it, and it also I think it taught me so much about UK environmental and climate policy and the UK government, and kind of, you know, I think I really appreciate sometimes, you know, what it feels like. It may not always feel like to everyone who kind of looks at the UK government, but to be in that space where you do push the boundaries and you do try and go further. But at the same time, as you said, the behaviour change point you picked up is so important. Australia was a world leader in car seat belts, and they had a really effective climate communications program with communications exercise, all about kind of black balloons, trying to help people visualize what carbon looked like, which was ahead of actually a lot of kind of government communications exercises that were happening elsewhere in the world. That is the real space that they lead on.
Fantastic. Okay, there was one last question that came in. I wonder if we could do this in 30 seconds. Can you sum up how you're working with other government departments to make sure that they help with your plan?
Yeah, so I mean, what I would say first of all is 25-year environment plan is a government plan. It's not a Defra plan. It's owned by all the departments. And we are working very hard to make sure that all the departments take responsibility for delivering against the plan. So, for example, we have a Cross Whitehall board where we bring together senior level people from all the departments, and we not only kind of tell them about what's going on, but we ask them to tell us what they're doing. And we are also working through Treasury and other central departments to think about things like the spending review, thinking about things like which will you know, give us the money for the next hopefully 3 years. We'll see where it comes out. And also things like making sure when departments do their delivery plans every year that they are reflecting on their environmental reporting and environmental policy making. There's the environmental principles bill, which they will be required to consider in most aspects of policy making. And also we have the greening government commitments, which means that departments actually have to green their own estates effectively in their own operations. And we will be publishing an annual report and also a new target framework in the coming weeks, which will kind of set out the next few years of activity in terms of greening government.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for all your questions, for all the people that have been listening and joined in. Thanks ever so much, Debbie Stockwell, for giving us that marvellous update and your insights on that. Thank you very much. And then if everyone wants to go over to the last session, we've got to wrap up to finish. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Debbie. Just to tell everyone that the last session of the day will take place in the stage rather than the sessions where everyone has been for the last couple of hours. So if you just click on the stage tab, that will be starting bang on 4 with Savita and Darren Moorcroft from the Woodland Trust. So thanks again, Simon. Thanks again, Debbie. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.